Aloha, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. My name is Sprinklebeard. I host a Twitch channel over at twitch.tv/Sprinklebeard, where we are focused on new player content and free-to-play content, meaning if you're trying not to spend money on a game, this is a good channel for you to watch, to learn, to gain some information from, and hopefully we'll teach you some today. So today we are going to look at a very, very bare-bone basics of the game. The reason that you would want to play Raid Shadow Legends, and then just some of the basics that maybe you've missed, maybe you've forgotten, maybe you weren't really sure what they did. So this video is going to be super elementary of describing Raid and helping out new players. Or if you're like, I've never understood why people even play Raid, this could be that video where, okay, cool, now I know why some people play Raid. So, let's not waste any time, let's jump into it. In Raid Shadow Legends, it's a very similar game to something like Pokemon, where you can get a bunch of different champions, and those different champions have different abilities compared to the ones before them, and it makes the game much more interesting because no two players like the exact same champion, and each player might pick something different than a different player, or even if you were both to get the exact same character, things will not be the same for you because everything in this game is randomized. The gear that drops, the items that you get, everything of that nature. With that being said, there are four main classes in this game of types of champions for you to kind of determine which you have a preference to, or for team balance to mix things up. Those four types would be attack, defense, HP, and support. Now, attack champions are usually more focused on their aggressive gameplay. They are more proactive. They are always doing something to put your opponent in a worse position. Your defense champions, and I'm just clicking through champions just to show off the artwork of the game, but defensive champions are more designed at outliving your opponent. They reduce a lot of damage. They might have a way to buff their party or take damage from the party to stop them from taking as much damage. Your HP champions are all purely about outliving your opponent. So they have a lot of things like poisons, HP burns, which is a damage over time effect in this game. They might have health recovery, or they might have ways to decrease your opponent's ability to kill them, and their goal is just to outlive and outlast your opponent. Last but not least, you have support champions. Support champions are always the champion that they amplify the abilities of other players on their team, of other champions. And their goal is to amplify their abilities in such a way that that character can just live and keep doing what it's doing without having to build something more defensively on them. Whereas their kit specifically is not necessarily designed for one-on-one combat, but more team-based combat, and will have great advantages for being on that proper team. So some of the stats in this game, we'll talk over those for a little bit. We'll leave it on Farrakhan the Fat here. He was one of my favorite champions for a very long time. Actually, here, let's do Bellower. Bellower was my first original favorite, and he's still one of my favorite design champions of the game. I think he's just amazingly built, just great stats and everything. So, perfect segue into stats, right? So, a basic barebone coverage of the stats are HP. HP is your character's ability to take damage. Obviously, when it hits 0, they die. Attack. Attack is usually associated with how much damage your character does. In this game, they do balance it out that defensive champions, their damage scales off their defense. HP champions, their damage scales off of their HP. Supports are kind of all over the place on how they deal damage, so take that by a case-by-case basis. Defense, in addition for defensive champions dealing more damage the more defense they have, it is also damage mitigation, so it kind of reduces that attack power. It is very rare for a defensive champion to ever... I've never seen like 0 numbers in this game, right? So the damage that your characters are outputting usually outweighs how much damage you can mitigate. However, there are some characters that can like self-heal, which, yes, they can out-heal how much damage you're doing. Speed is how fast your character can go. There's also a turn meter when you're in combat that goes on a scale of 0 to 100, and that will determine who goes in what order. And there are characters that can affect turn meter, such as like Coldheart here, and completely reduce somebody's turn meter, thus meaning that their speed doesn't really matter. As long as Coldheart gets a turn somewhere in there, she could stop somebody else from getting a turn. Crit rate is your chance to critically hit. When you critically hit, it takes your crit damage and multiplies the damage that you were going to do. So in this case, if we take away all the green numbers here, if Coldheart was, let's say, going to do 100 damage, and then she critically hit, she would do 157 damage instead. Now, the numbers get a lot more complicated than that, because obviously you see her attack is closer to like 4,000. So when you take 4,000, multiply it by 57%, and then eventually, 57 plus 230, the numbers get kind of crazy in this game, but something that's fun about it. Resistance is your character's ability to resist a debuff. So some characters in this game have these red debuffs that they can place on your party, whereas buffs and things would be in the blue. So somebody like Farrakhan the Fat can buff up your party, as well as place debuffs on your opponent. Resistance is your ability, your champion's ability, to resist having a debuff placed on them. It is not a 100% guarantee, but for the most part, you will more often than not stop that debuff or that turn meter reduction, which some champions have the ability to mess with that yellow bar we mentioned, to stop or block what your opponent is doing. Accuracy is the vice versa, is your character's ability to land his debuffs or his or her debuffs. Its debuffs. Your champion's ability to reduce, to apply their debuffs. So, usually in this game right now, the speed and accuracy are kind of two of the most important stats on many, many champions. There are absolutely champions in the game that do not require accuracy or might not require resistance, depending on what they're doing or what their capabilities are. So somebody like Blind Seer can take away an entire team's need for resistance because she literally puts on a buff that blocks debuffs. But just like Blind Seer, there are champions where it doesn't matter if your opponent puts on a block debuff. There are champions that can remove buffs from enemies and then put on debuffs. So it's never a surefire thing, and it makes it very complicated to come up with like the perfect team. Even a dream team will have somebody that counters it or will have some skill that will throw a monkey wrench and makes it a lot of fun. In this game, you can see in the upper right hand corner here, you have 9 slots to customize your character with, and then there even is a mastery series of trees for you to customize your character and to have your character maybe be different or maybe be a little bit more clever than, the standard one. So there are some creative things that you can do. Yes, there are some best practices or some practices that are, more advantageous than others. Some champions are champions I just haven't built yet, but your weapons in this game must have a primary stat of attack. They can be no other primary stat than attack. And then their substats can be any of the substats except for defense and defense percentage, because obviously it's your weapon. On contrary to that, we'll talk about shields. Shields are your defensive stat. And just like the sword, not being able to have some stats, cannot have any attack or attack percentage substats of any kind. Your helmet will always be a primary stat of HP, and then can have any of the substats. Next, we're going to talk about the middle three here, which are going to get a lot more complicated. Gloves can have a series of any type of stats except for speed, resistance, and accuracy. Now, currently in the game, it is a best practice that majority of gloves will be crit rate, unless you're doing like something like an HP champion or a defense champion or maybe a support. You might want the HP or defense percentage, and then you would worry about your substats being some of the other stats, which could include speed, resistance, and accuracy. Some champions that get really hyper aggressive actually use crit damage gauntlets, and then you try to find crit rate amongst the rest of your gear, or maybe in your kit you have a bonus to having crit rate that helps you reach that 100% crit rate. Next, when we talk about body armor in this game is not just purely defensive stats. Yes, it can be HP percentage or defense percentage, but you can even do things like attack percentage. For the most part, not a lot of champions end up going with like resistance or accuracy. There might be some champions that do go with that just to really force home what they are aiming to do, and for you to have the most consistent gameplay that you can. They can have substats of any of these values. Last but not least, we have boots. And currently, best and only practice is for most players to have speed boots on all of their characters. There are certain shenanigans that you can do with like attack boots, but understand that those are just that. They are shenanigans. They're very gimmicky, not wildly reliable. And depending on what your champion is designed to do and what the rest of your champion party is designed to do, will greatly affect how you will approach combat in this game. The other three slots that I didn't mention right away are your rings, amulets, and banners. Rings give you a flat stat, such as your HP, attack, or defense, and then their substats are only HP, attack, and defense. So this is to increase your base stats in the game. Next, your amulet can be defense, HP, or crit damage. And then the substats can be anything like accuracy, resistance, HP, attack, defense, or crit damage if the main stat is not any of those things. So because the main stat here is defense, that means I could not get a defense substat on this. That's true about all gear. Lastly, your banners can be things like accuracy, resistance, attack, defense, or HP. And then the substats can be things like defense, defense percentage, HP percentage, attack percentage, speed. I don't believe their substats can be things like accuracy and resistance, or maybe I just haven't seen it yet. In this game, you can see in the lower left here, there's a different symbol for each of the characters. So we have magic, and magic ends up beating spirit. Spirit ends up beating force, and force ends up beating magic. So you have this triangle of rock, paper, scissors between the three. Last but not least, you have void, and void has no inherent advantages over any of the other affinities, but no inherent weaknesses over the other affinities. So they're kind of a jack of all trades, good in all situations, or can have stats that all the others have. In this game, when you are attacking in a positive affinity, so if you are a magic attacking into a spirit champion, usually your character has an easier time of landing their debuffs, does increased damage, or even has increased crit chance to land against that weaker affinity. Vice versa, if you have a spirit champion attacking into a magic champion, you can have things like weak hits. Weak hits deal less damage, have less of a chance to crit, or often have their damage halved, and they cannot apply their debuffs on a weak hit. So the strategy in this game becomes exceptionally complex because obviously you kind of want to have one of every affinity, or you want to make sure that if your team has a weakness to a certain affinity, that your void champions might cover that up, or that your team party might have so many debuffs in it or so many buffs in it that you can easily outlast your opponent and maybe take care of their one or two problematic characters that work against your team. Just like in Pokemon, some characters have a passive where whenever it is their turn, something happens, or they might bring extra resistance or extra utility to the party. And then some champions even have an aura skill, meaning that if they are the party leader, they increase everybody's, in this case, HP in all battles. Or in this case, increases their allied defense in all battles. It just depends on what you want your party to do, or who has the best aura, depending on what content you're aiming at clearing. In this game, there are currently 14 different factions going on. Though there's no real incentive to have loyalty to one faction or another, each of us has our own appeals, right? Things that turn us on and make us want to play the game. So we have things like the Banner Lords and the Sacred Order, which are more of your human-oriented classes that are more of your, medieval-style characters. We do have things like High Elves. And Barbarians. And something that this game does exceptionally well is the way the characters look. One character to the next, it's very rare that characters look the same. Yes, there are some reskins or some recolors. That's because the game has only been out for about 2 years. But a lot of the newer characters that are coming out are amazing design. And even some of the older characters have a super amazing design. And it just so happened that they had to use, a reskin to get more characters into the game. And that's okay. You do have things like ogres as well. And alongside of ogres, you have the orcs. And sometimes some of the characters kind of cross over and might look similar to a different faction just because. And it's something that makes this game really, really fun because you never know what a certain faction might get on the next patch release or whatnot. What's fun as well is that the longer that you play this game, you end up finding certain characters that are more appealing to you or that reach out to you, and you'll have more fun playing just discovering newer champions, or when you finally get certain things like legendaries, which feel very rare in this game. But it's a great feeling when you get a legendary and finding out where they're best at and how to use them effectively in a party, and how much the game changes when you get your first legendary champion. Here, I just want to showcase more of the artwork, a little bit from each faction. In the upper left-hand corner, it will tell you what faction we are currently looking at, so that way I don't have to read every single one. Let's do Mother Cybele. But I feel like this game has a very good taste in everybody will find something that they are very interested in terms of the gameplay, in terms of a mental challenge. And it just depends on what your interest is in the game. So guys, this is what I would consider the very bare bones, super basics of Raid Shadow Legends. Next, we're going to be covering the different types of battles that you can do in the game. I'm not going to go into immense detail on each one. So for instance, when we talk about the campaign, we'll be talking about the campaign in a nutshell, not necessarily a hard strategy on how to beat each and every boss in it. That will depend on what champions you have available. But each dungeon will get its own video. We will talk about every single dungeon, but things like the Doom Tower or Faction Wars, it would just be immense for me to talk about every single floor and certain strategies, but we will eventually get to some of the bosses in the Doom Tower. That is end game content, and since we on the channel are much more focused on new player content, we are going to be focused on getting you the basics and good understandings of how to progress further into the game. So if you guys liked what you watched, make sure to hit that like button or subscribe here on YouTube. If you want to interact with me, come join us over on Twitch. We stream currently 5, sometimes 6 days a week over at twitch.tv/sprinklebeard. I'm on Eastern Standard Time. I'm in the Philadelphia time zone. So if you're looking for me, I'm usually on at 11 a.m. till about 3 p.m. in the afternoons. Thank you all very much for watching, and until that next time, ta-ta.